Desire is the first datum of our consciousness. We are born into sympathy and antipathy, wishing and willing. Unconsciously at first, then consciously, we evaluate. This is good, that is bad. And a little later, we discover obligation. This being good ought to be done. That being bad ought not to be done. All evaluations are not equally valid. We are called upon to pass judgment on what our desires and dislikes affirm to be good or bad. Very often we discover that the verdict of the higher court is at variance with the decision reached so quickly and lightheartedly in the court of first instance. In the light of what we know about ourselves, our fellow beings, and the world at large, we discover that what at first seemed good may, in the long run, or in the larger context, be bad, and that what at first seemed bad may be good, which we feel ourselves under obligation to accomplish. When we say that a man has a strong moral character, we mean that he is ready to act upon the findings of his insight, even when these findings are unpleasantly or even excruciatingly at variance with his first spontaneous valuations. In actual practice, moral insight is never a strictly personal matter. The judge administers a system of law and is guided by precedent. In other words, every individual is the member of a community, which has a moral code based upon past findings of what in fact is good in the longer run in the wider context. In most circumstances, most of the members of any given society permit themselves to be guided by the generally accepted code of morals. A few reject the code, either in its entirety or in part, and a few choose to live by another, higher, and more exacting code. In Christian phraseology, there are the few who stubbornly persist in living in a state of mortal sin and antisocial lawlessness. There are the many who obey the laws, make the precepts of morality their guide, repent of mortal sins when they commit them, but do not make much effort to avoid venial sins. And finally, there are the few whose righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, who are guided by the counsels of perfection and have the insight to perceive and the character to avoid venial sins and even imperfections. Philosophers and theologians have sought to establish a theoretical basis for the existing moral codes, by whose aid individual men and women pass judgment on their spontaneous evaluations. From Moses to Bentham, from Epicurus to Calvin, from the Christian and Buddhist philosophies of universal love to the lunatic doctrines of nationalism and racial superiority. The list is long and the span of thought enormously wide, but fortunately there is no need for us to consider these various theories. Our concern is only with the perennial philosophy and with the system of ethical principles which those who believe in that philosophy have used when passing judgment on their own and other people's evaluations. The questions that we have to ask in this section are simple enough, and simple too are the answers. As always, the difficulties begin only when we pass from theory to practice, from ethical principle to particular application. Granted that the ground of the individual soul is akin to or identical with the divine ground of all of existence, and granted that this divine ground is an ineffable Godhead that manifests itself as personal God or even as the incarnate Logos, what is the ultimate nature of good and evil, and what the true purpose and last end of human life? The answers to these questions will be given to a great extent in the words of that most surprisingly product of the English 18th century, William Law. How very odd our educational system is. Students of English literature are forced to be read the graceful journalism of Steele and Addison, are expected to know all about the minor novels of Defoe and the tiny elegances of Matthew Prior, but they can pass all their examinations summa cum laude without having so much as looked into the writings of a man who was not only a master of English prose, but also one of the most interesting thinkers of his period and one of the most endearingly saintly figures in the whole history of Anglicanism. Our current neglect of law is yet another of the many indications that 20th century educators have ceased to be concerned with questions of ultimate truth or meaning, and, apart from mere vocational training, are interested solely in the dissemination of a rootless and irrelevant culture and the fostering of the solemn foolery of scholarship for scholarship's sake. Nothing burns in hell but the self. The mind is on fire. Thoughts are on fire. Mind consciousness and the impressions received by the mind, and the sensations that arise from the impressions that the mind receives, these too are on fire. And with what are they on fire? With the fire of greed, with the fire of resentment, with the fire of infatuation, with birth, old age, and death, with sorrow and lamentation, with misery and grief and despair, they are on fire. From the Buddha's Fire Sermon. If thou hast not seen the devil, look at thine own self. Rumi. Your own self is your own Cain that murders your own Abel. For every action and motion of self has the spirit of Antichrist and murders the divine life within you. William Law. The city of God is made by the love of God pushed to the contempt of self. The earthly city, by the love of self pushed to the contempt of God. St. Augustine. The difference between a good and a bad man does not lie in this, that the one wills that which is good and the other does not, but solely in this, that the one concurs with the living, inspiring spirit of God within him, and the other resists it, and can be chargeable with evil only because he resists it. William Law. People should think less about what they ought to do and more about what they ought to be. If only their being were good, their works would shine forth brightly. Do not imagine that you can ground your salvation upon actions. It must rest on what you are. The ground upon which good character rests is this very same ground from which man's work derives its value, namely a mind wholly turned to God. Verily, if you were so minded, you might tread on a stone, and it would be a more pious work than if you, simply for your own profit, were to receive the body of the Lord, and were wanting in spiritual detachment. Eckhart. Man is made by his belief. As he believes, so he is. Bhagavad Gita. It is mind which gives to themes their quality, their foundation, and their being. Whoever speaks or acts with impure mind, him sorrow follows, as the wheel follows the steps of the ox that draws the cart. Dhammapada. The nature of a man's being determines the nature of his actions, and the nature of his being comes to manifestation first of all in the mind. What he craves and thinks, what he believes and feels, this is, so to speak, the Logos. By whose agency, an individual's fundamental character performs its creative acts. These acts will be beautifully and morally good if the being is God-centered, bad and ugly if it is centered in the personal self. The stone, says Eckhart, performs its work without ceasing, day and night, for even when it is not actually falling, the stone has weight. A man's being is his potential energy directed towards or away from God, and it is by this potential energy that he will be judged as good or evil, for it is possible, in the language of the gospel, to commit adultery and murder in the heart, even while remaining blameless in action. Covetousness, envy, pride, and wrath are the four elements of self, or nature, or hell, all of them inseparable from it. And reason why it must be thus, and cannot be otherwise, is because the natural life of the creature is brought forth for the participation of some high supernatural good in the Creator, but it could have no fitness, no possible capacity to receive such good, unless it was in itself both an extremity of want and an extremity of desire for some high good. When therefore this natural life is deprived of, or fallen from God, it can be nothing else in itself but an extremity of want continually desiring, and an extremity of desire continually wanting. And because it is that, its whole life can be nothing else but a plague of torment and covetousness, envy, pride, and wrath, all which is precisely nature, self, or hell. Now covetousness, pride, and envy are not three different things, but only three different names for the restless workings of one and the same will or desire. Wrath, which is a fourth birth, from these three, can have no existence till one or all of these are contradicted or have something done to them that is contrary to their will. These four properties generate their own torment. They have no outward cause, nor any inward power of altering themselves, and therefore all self or nature must be in this state until some supernatural good comes into it, or gets a birth in it. Whilst man indeed lives among the vanities of time, his covetousness, envy, pride, and wrath may be in a tolerable state, may hold him to a mixture of peace and trouble. They may have at times their gratification as well as their torments. But when death has put an end to the vanity of all earthly cheats, the soul that is not born again of the supernatural Word and Spirit of God must find itself unavoidably devoured or shut up in its own insatiable, unchangeable, self-tormenting covetousness, envy, pride, and wrath. William Law. It is true that you cannot properly express the degree of your sinfulness, but that is because it is impossible in this life to represent sins in all their true ugliness, nor shall we ever know them as they really are, except in the light of God. God gives to some souls an impression of their enormity of sin, by which he makes them feel that sin is incomparably greater than it seems. Such souls must conceive their sins as faith represents them, that is, as they are in themselves, but must be content to describe them in such human words as their mouth is able to utter. Charles Lucifer, when he stood in his natural nobility, as God had created him, was a pure, noble creature, but when he kept to self, when he possessed himself in his natural ability as a property, he fell and became, instead of an angel, a devil. So it is with man. If he remains in himself and possesses himself of his natural nobility as a property, he falls and becomes, instead of a man, a devil. The following of Christ. If a delicious fragrant fruit had a power of separating itself from the rich spirit, fine taste, smell, and color, which it receives from the virtue of the air and the spirit of the sun, or if it could, in the beginning of its growth, turn away from the sun and receive no virtue from it, then it would stand in its own first birth of wrath, sourness, bitterness, astringency, just as devils do, who have turned back into their own dark root and have rejected the light and spirit of God, so that the hellish nature of a devil is nothing but its own first forms of life withdrawn or separated from the heavenly light and love, just as the sourness, bitterness, astringency are nothing else but the first form of its vegetable life, before it has reached the virtue of the sun and the spirit of the air. And as a fruit, if it had a sensibility of itself, would be full of torment as soon as it was shut up in the first forms of its life, in its own astringency, sourness, and stinging bitterness. So the angels, when they had turned back into these very same first forms of their life and broke off from the heavenly light and love of God, became their own hell. No hell was made for them, no new qualities came into them, no vengeance or pains from the Lord of love fell upon them. They only stood in that state of division and separation from the Son and Holy Spirit of God, which by their own motion they had made for themselves. They had nothing in them but what they had from God, the first forms of a heavenly life, but they had them in a state of self-torment, because they had separated from them from birth of love and light. William Law. In all the possibilities of things, there is and can be but one happiness and one misery. The one misery is nature and creature left to itself. The one happiness is the life, the light, the Spirit of God, manifested in nature and creature. This is the true meaning of the words of our Lord. There is but one that is good, and that is God. William Law. Men are not in hell because God is angry with them. They are in wrath and darkness because they have done to the light, which infinitely flows forth from God, as that man does to the light of the sun, who puts out his own eyes. William Law. Though the light and comfort of the outward world keeps even the worst of men from any constant strong sensibility of that wrathful, fiery, dark, and self-tormenting nature that is the very essence of every fallen, unregrettable soul, yet every man in the world has more or less frequent and strong intimations given him, so that it is with him in the inmost ground of his soul. How many inventions are some people forced to have recourse to in order to keep off a certain inward uneasiness, which they are afraid of, and know not whence it comes. Alas, it is because there is a fallen spirit, a dark aching fire within them, which has never had its proper relief and is trying to discover itself and calling out for help at every cessation of worldly joy. In the Hebrew Christian tradition, the fall is subsequent to creation and is due exclusively to the egocentric use of a free will, which ought to have remained centered in the divine ground and not in the separate selfhood. The myth of Genesis embodies a very important psychological truth, but falls short of being an entirely satisfactory symbol, because it fails to mention, much less to account for, the fact of evil and suffering in the non-human world. To be adequate to our experience, the myth would have to be modified in two ways. In the first place, it would have to make clear that creation, the incomprehensible passage from the unmanifested one into the manifest multiplicity of nature, from eternity into time, is not merely the prelude and necessary condition of the fall. To some extent, it is the fall. And in the same place, it would have to indicate that something analogous to free will may exist below the human level, that the passage from the unity of spiritual to the manifoldness of temporal being is an essential part of the fall, as clearly stated in the Buddhist and Hindu renderings of the Perennial philosophy. Pain and evil are inseparable from individual existence in a world of time, And for human beings, there is an intensification of this inevitable pain and evil when the desire is turned towards the self and the many, rather than towards the divine ground. To this, we might speculatively add the opinion that perhaps even subhuman existences may be endowed, both individually and collectively, as kinds and species, with something resembling the power of choice. There is the extraordinary fact that man stands alone, that, so far as we can judge, every other species is a species of living fossils, capable only of degeneration and extinction, not of further evolutionary advance. In the phraseology of scholastic Aristotelianism, matter possesses an appetite for form, not necessarily for the best form, but for form as such. Looking about us in the world of living things, we observe, with a delighted wonder, touched occasionally, it must be admitted, with a certain questioning dismay, the innumerable forms, always beautiful, often extravagantly odd and sometimes even sinister, in which the insatiable appetite of matter has found its satisfaction. Of all this living matter, only that which is organized as human beings has succeeded in finding a form capable, at any rate on the mental side, of further development. All the rest is now locked up in forms that can only remain what they are, or, if they change, only change for the worse. It looks as though, in the cosmic intelligence test, all living matter, except the human, had succumbed, at one time or another during its biological career, to the temptation of assuming, not the ultimately best, but the immediately most profitable form. By an act of something analogous to free will, every species, except the human, has chosen the quick returns of specialization, the present rapture of being perfect, but perfect on a low level of being. The result is that they stand at the end of evolutionary blind alleys. To the initial cosmic fall of creation, a multitudinous manifestation in time, they have added the obscurely biological equivalent of man's voluntary fall. As species, they have chosen the immediate satisfaction of the self, rather than the capacity for reunion with the divine ground. For this wrong choice, the non-human forms of life are punished negatively by being debarred from realizing the supreme good to which only the unspecialized and therefore freer, more highly conscious form is capable. But it must be remembered, of course, that the capacity for supreme good is achieved only at the price of becoming also capable of extreme evil. Animals do not suffer in so many ways, nor, we may feel pretty certain, to the same extent as do men and women. Further, they are quite innocent of that literally diabolic wickedness, which, together with sanctity, is one of the distinguishing marks of the human species. We see then that, for the perennial philosophy, good is the separate self's conformity to, and finally annihilation in, the divine ground which gives it being. Evil, the intensification of separateness, the refusal to know that the ground exists. The doctrine is, of course, perfectly compatible with the formulation of ethical principles as a series of negative and positive divine commandments, or even in terms of social utility. But crimes which are everywhere forbidden proceed from states of mind which are everywhere condemned as wrong. And these wrong states of mind are, as a matter of empirical fact, absolutely incompatible with that unitive knowledge of divine ground, which, according to the perennial philosophy, is the supreme good.